Most recently, Indonesia has been held up as a model for Egypt, for good or bad reasons, to emulate political transition, as our leaders from across sectors largely sought unity and progress over parochial gain. Since then, Indonesia has been quietly yet steadily rising. The last bit is basically on Indonesia. I want to share a little story on my meeting and discussion with an economist by the name of Jim O'Neill, who basically coined the acronym BRIC some years ago, around the year 2000. And when I met him in September or October last year, he basically showed me one of the pages of this presentation, which he gives out to many people around the world. And on that particular page, he basically made the point that Indonesia's economic delta in the next 10 years is going to be a mere 500 billion US. And I go, Jim, we're talking about a country whose economy last year, or in 2010, was already over 700 billion US. And if we were to extrapolate that on a straight line basis, or even non-linearly, at 6 to 7% real growth, by the year 2020, it's not inconceivable for the economy to be at around 2 trillion. As such, the economic delta should be at about 1.3 trillion US dollars. Let's even discount that by 30%. The discounted figure would still be far greater than the 500 billion US of economic delta that he's been telling the whole world. And this is a reflection of, I think, how many people around the world have been perceiving Indonesia. I always kid with people that there's a lot of people in Oklahoma who still don't know where Indonesia is. And that's true. And, you know, as much as he and I were colleagues at Goldman before, I dared to ask him in terms of, or as to when he was in Indonesia the last time. And he goes, well, I think probably 1994 or 1995. And I go, Jim, we got Starbucks today. We have tall buildings in Indonesia. You may want to make an attempt to come to Indonesia. And I'm happy to report that, you know, as early as about 5 or 6 weeks ago, he made a comment about this new acronym or this new classification of or grouping of countries, which would include the BRIC countries plus a few other countries such as Indonesia, South Korea, Mexico, and Turkey. By virtue of the measurement of any one of these countries having a GDP comprising more than 1% of the global GDP. Taking into account the global GDP of about 68 trillion US dollars, Indonesia's 700 billion just qualifies it to be in excess of 1% of the global GDP. I think the new grouping is called the New World, and that, I hope, will set a different flavor of Indonesia. If one takes a 3-year view of Indonesia, there's no reason for Indonesia not to be growing to about $1 trillion by 2014. If one takes a 10-year view, it will be at about 2 trillion. If one takes a 15-year view of Indonesia, the economy is poised to grow to about 4 trillion US dollars. If one takes a 20-year view of Indonesia, it's possible for the economy to grow to about 6 or 7 trillion US dollars, assuming the population of 240 million people growing to about 285 to 300 million people by the year 2030. Then Indonesia would have a GDP per capita of more than $22,000. Now, you put that in the context of where SBY has taken the country. When he took on office, the economy was a mere 1,100 US dollars GDP per capita. Today, it is already more than $3,000, so he's tripled the economy in a mere 5.5 years. And if we are to take a 10 to 15-year view of the country, it looks pretty good. And the natural question is, with respect to why the linearity in the assumption, I have a pretty good explanation for that. Indonesia is blessed with good demographics. This is what many of us have called as the demographic bonus. 60% of our population are younger than 39 years old. 50% of our population are younger than 29 years old. And the good thing about Indonesians is that we are reproductive. Unlike our neighbors in Southeast Asia, unlike our neighbors in Asia. So it's a good chance that we're going to be able to maintain that demographic profile for the next 10, 15, or if not 20 years. And what it means is that youth translates to productivity. Productivity translates to profit. Profit translates to economic sizing. Now the key is whether or not we can get our act together on making sure that these young Indonesians get educated in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We were not so blessed in terms of having built, the necessary educational infrastructure like countries like India, Singapore, or Malaysia. We've only been able to produce about 5,000 PhDs in the last 30 years, compared to 250,000 by China. But at the rate we're now allocating 20% of our fiscal budget for educational purposes, I think there's a good reason for some of us young Indonesians to believe in the new future of Indonesia. At the rate that we're pumping $25 billion US for education this year, and we're going to be pumping more and more money for educational purposes year by year in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I've got to believe, I think the future for myself and for my kids and for my grandkids is going to be better. Thank you very much for your time.